The story takes place in a well-known high school in a big city. The school has a strong reputation for academic excellence. It is known for producing top students who go on to attend prestigious universities. The teachers are experienced, and the students come from different backgrounds. One of the most respected teachers in the school is Mr. Richards. He has been teaching for over 20 years and is well known for his strict teaching style. He expects discipline and hard work from his students. Some admire him for pushing students to do their best, while others fear him. Many students say he is fair, but some have noticed he treats certain students better than others. One day, a new student named Jamal joins the class. He is quiet, well-behaved, and focused. He sits in the middle of the room, observing everything carefully. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, his words are thoughtful. He seems smart, but he also looks cautious, as if he is unsure of how he will be treated in this new environment. As Jamal settles into his seat, a few students glance at him and whisper. He looks different from most of the class. Some students make quick judgments about him. Others stay neutral, waiting to see how he will fit in. Mr. Richards enters the classroom, holding a stack of papers. His sharp eyes scan the room, stopping when they land on Jamal. His expression changes slightly, but he says nothing at first. He moves toward the board and begins writing down the day's lesson. Throughout the class, Mr. Richards watches Jamal closely. He asks him a question, and Jamal answers correctly, but instead of acknowledging his response, Mr. Richards simply nods and moves on. There is no praise, no sign of encouragement. As the days go by, Jamal notices something strange. Mr. Richards treats him differently. He rarely smiles at him, and his tone is colder when addressing him. When Jamal submits his assignments, Mr. Richards checks them quickly, barely looking at the content. Jamal doesn't react. He stays quiet, focusing on his work. But the air in the classroom feels heavy. The tension grows each day. Some students start noticing. Others pretend not to see. Jamal wonders if it's all in his head. But deep down, he knows something isn't right. From the moment Jamal enters Mr. Richards' class, things begin to feel different for him. At first, he assumes the teacher is just strict with everyone. But soon, he realizes that Mr. Richards treats him differently. Every day, Mr. Richards calls on Jamal more than any other student. While most students get easy or general questions, Jamal is always given the hardest ones. The questions are tricky, often outside the lessons they discussed in class. It feels like a test, one designed to make him fail. But Jamal is sharp. He studies hard and pays attention. Even when the questions are difficult, he answers them correctly. Each time, Mr. Richards' face tightens, showing brief flashes of irritation. He never praises Jamal. Instead, he quickly moves on to the next student, acting as if nothing happened. One day, after a writing assignment, Mr. Richards returns the graded papers. Jamal looks at his grade and frowns. A big red C is marked on his paper. He flips through it, scanning for corrections. There are barely any mistakes. His handwriting is neat, and his points are well organized. Confused, he compares his paper to the student sitting next to him. The other student has messier handwriting, but they received a much higher grade. Jamal swallows his frustration and approaches Mr. Richards after class. "Excuse me, sir, I just wanted to ask about my grade," he says politely. Mr. Richards barely looks at him. "Your handwriting is difficult to read," he replies. Jamal blinks. "But I thought it was clear," he says carefully. Mr. Richards sighs and leans back. "Are you questioning my grading?" His voice is sharp. Jamal shakes his head quickly. "No, sir. I just wanted to understand so I can improve." Mr. Richards stares at him for a moment, then says, "Work harder next time," before turning away. Jamal clenches his fists but nods. "Yes, sir." He walks back to his seat, feeling a weight in his chest. The other students begin to notice. They see how Mr. Richards singles Jamal out. Some students start whispering about it. Others stay quiet, afraid to get involved. A few even start making jokes at Jamal's expense, laughing when the teacher embarrasses him. Mr. Richards never stops them. If anything, he seems to encourage it. Jamal feels the pressure building every day, but no matter what happens, he stays respectful. He doesn't argue. He doesn't complain. He just keeps doing his best. But no matter how hard he tries, Mr. Richards keeps making things harder for him. The classroom is filled with the sound of rustling papers as students prepare to submit their assignments. It's a routine task, one they've done many times before. Mr. Richards stands at the front, arms crossed, waiting for each student to place their work on his desk. Jamal takes out his neatly written paper, double-checking it before walking up to the desk. He places it on the pile with the others and returns to his seat. He feels relieved, knowing he put a lot of effort into the assignment. Mr. Richards begins flipping through the papers, scanning each one. Then he suddenly stops. His eyes narrow as he holds up Jamal's paper. "This is late," he announces, his voice sharp. Jamal looks up, confused. "No, sir, I just turned it in with everyone else," he says politely. Mr. Richards shakes his head. "No, you didn't. I called for the papers and yours wasn't here." Jamal's heart starts to race. "But I put it on the desk with the others," he insists. The classroom grows silent. Everyone watches, waiting to see what happens next. Mr. Richards sighs loudly and holds up Jamal's assignment. "You think you can bend the rules, but in my class, there are consequences," he says. Before Jamal can respond, Mr. Richards takes both sides of the paper and tears it in half. The sound of ripping paper fills the room. A few students gasp, but then laughter erupts from the back of the class. Some students whisper to each other, smirking. Others shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jamal sits frozen, his face burning. He blinks quickly, holding back the sting in his eyes. Mr. Richards tosses the torn pieces into the trash can. "If you can't follow simple instructions, you won't go far," he says. His voice is firm, but there's something else in it, something cruel. Jamal takes a deep breath. He wants to defend himself, to say something, anything, but he knows it won't make a difference. "Yes, sir," he says quietly, lowering his head. Mr. Richards turns away, as if Jamal no longer exists. "Let this be a lesson to everyone," he says to the class. "Rules matter." Jamal sits still, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He can hear the whispers around him, the quiet chuckles of those who enjoy the show. A few students glance at him with sympathy, but no one speaks up. No one dares to challenge Mr. Richards. Jamal clenches his jaw, swallowing his frustration. He won't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But deep inside, something shifts. This isn't just about a grade. It's about something bigger. And Jamal knows it. The school announces a parent-teacher meeting, and Mr. Richards barely gives it a second thought. He has already decided what he will say about Jamal. In his mind, the meeting will be short and simple. Jamal is a troublemaker. He doesn't follow rules. He lacks discipline. That's the version of events Mr. Richards plans to share. He assumes that, like many other students in similar situations, Jamal's parents won't even bother to show up. Maybe they're too busy, or maybe they just don't care. Either way, he expects to sit in an empty chair and move on. When the day of the meeting arrives, parents start walking into the room. Some greet him politely, others nervously. Mr. Richards keeps his usual firm demeanor, shaking hands and nodding as he moves through the conversations. Then the door opens again. The room goes silent. A woman steps inside, moving with quiet confidence. She is well-dressed but not flashy, carrying herself with a kind of authority that demands respect. The other parents notice her immediately, whispering to each other. Even the principal, who had been standing near the back of the room, straightens up upon seeing her. Mr. Richards looks up, ready to introduce himself. But the moment his eyes meet hers, something in his expression changes. He recognizes her. She is Monica Williams, one of the most well-respected women in the city. A powerful businesswoman, a leader in charity work, and a strong advocate for education. She has been featured in newspapers and interviewed on television. She has funded scholarships for underprivileged students and has spoken at major events about the importance of fair treatment in schools. And she is Jamal's mother. Mr. Richards swallows hard, suddenly unsure of himself. Monica approaches him, extending her hand. "Mr. Richards, it's nice to finally meet you," she says, her voice polite but firm. He shakes her hand, his grip weaker than usual. "Mrs. Williams, of course. Please, have a seat." She takes a seat across from him, crossing her legs gracefully. She doesn't waste time with small talk. "I wanted to speak with you about Jamal's progress in your class," she says. Mr. Richards hesitates. His usual confidence is gone. His mind races for words, but nothing sounds right. For the first time in years, Mr. Richards feels like he is the one being tested. Monica Williams sits across from Mr. Richards, her posture composed but firm. Her presence alone commands attention. The other parents watch closely, sensing that this meeting will not be like the others. She adjusts her handbag, then looks straight at Mr. Richards. "I'd like to discuss my son's grades," she says calmly. Mr. Richards shifts in his chair. He clears his throat. "Of course, Jamal is, well, he's a student who struggles to meet expectations," he says, choosing his words carefully. Monica tilts her head slightly. "That's interesting," she replies. She reaches into her bag and pulls out a neatly organized folder. She places it on the desk, flipping it open. Inside are copies of Jamal's graded assignments, with red marks and unfair deductions all over them. She slides one across the table. "This was a well-written essay, yet it received a C. There are barely any corrections on the page. No explanation for the low score." Mr. Richards glances at it but says nothing. She places another sheet in front of him. This math test had correct answers marked as wrong. Even the grading key from the school shows that Jamal's answers were right. The room remains silent. Some of the other parents lean in, curious. Monica's voice remains steady. "These are just a few examples. I've reviewed all of Jamal's work, and there is a clear pattern: unfair treatment, inconsistent grading." Mr. Richards forces a smile. "Mrs. Williams, I assure you, grading is subjective. I treat all my students the same." Monica raises an eyebrow. "Do you?" She glances at the parents around her. "Because Jamal has also told me about the way he is treated in class, the unnecessary pressure, the humiliation, the way other students are encouraged, directly or indirectly, to laugh at him." A quiet murmur spreads through the room. Some parents nod slightly, as if confirming suspicions they have had for a while. Mr. Richards exhales sharply. "That's simply not true," he says quickly. Jamal, who has been silent this whole time, finally speaks up. "It is true," he says, his voice steady but low. Everyone turns to him. Jamal looks at his mother, who nods encouragingly. He takes a deep breath and continues. "Every day, I'm called on more than anyone else. I get harder questions. When I do well, there's no recognition. When I make the smallest mistake, it's pointed out in front of the whole class." He looks down at his hands, then back up. "Mr. Richards tore up my assignment in front of everyone. He said I didn't follow the rules when I did. The other students laughed because they knew he wouldn't stop them." The room falls into complete silence. More parents whisper among themselves. Some glance at Mr. Richards with suspicion. Others frown, realizing this isn't just an exaggeration. The principal, who has been observing the conversation, finally steps forward. "Mr. Richards, do you have an explanation for this?" His voice is firm, his arms crossed. Mr. Richards looks around, as if searching for an escape. I simply hold all my students to high standards," he stammers. The principal doesn't blink. "That's not what I asked." Mr. Richards struggles to defend himself, but he knows, this time he won't get away with it. The room remains tense as the principal stares at Mr. Richards, waiting for a proper explanation, but none comes. The silence stretches too long, and the weight of the accusations is undeniable. The principal clears his throat. "We will be launching a full investigation," he announces. His voice is sharp, leaving no room for argument. Word spreads quickly. Students begin speaking up. Some confirm what Jamal said, how Mr. Richards targeted him, how he treated him differently, how he made him feel small. Others recall moments when they, too, had felt the sting of his favoritism or unfairness. Teachers start whispering as well. Some had suspected his behavior, but had never spoken out. Now, they don't have to. The truth is out. The school board takes action. They begin reviewing complaints, both old and new. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Richards has a history of similar behavior. Complaints had been made before, but they had been ignored or dismissed. This time, with Jamal's case gaining attention, they can't be brushed aside. Days later, the final decision is made. Mr. Richards is placed on suspension. The school board will decide his ultimate fate, but for now, he is no longer in the classroom. For the first time in a long while, Jamal feels seen. He walks into school knowing he no longer has to sit through unfair treatment. His classmates look at him differently, not with pity, but with respect. Some even apologize for laughing, for staying silent, for not standing up when they should have. His mother places a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," she tells him. "You stood up for yourself, and that takes strength." Jamal nods, feeling the truth in her words. The classroom feels different now, lighter, freer. The fear is gone.